When we think of wild animals, many of us imagine beautiful creatures like deer or wolves. But sometimes these animals can pose a real danger to humans, a fact that was made all too apparent when a 54-year-old woman in Thailand encountered a 23-foot-long python. Thankfully, the local authorities were able to come to the rescue and help her escape the situation unscathed. In this video, we will look at the events surrounding this incredible story, as well as explore other python-related incidents from around the world. The story began in a small village in Thailand, where 54-year-old Mrs. Praphan Puttawong lived with her family. One day, while walking around the outskirts of her village, Mrs. Praphan was suddenly confronted by an unexpected and terrifying sight, a 23-foot-long python. Mrs. Praphan immediately ran back to her home and alerted her neighbors, who came to investigate the situation. When they arrived at the scene, they were all shocked to discover that not only was the snake still there, but it had also begun wrapping itself around a nearby tree. It is thought that this particular python had wandered into the area from a nearby jungle, seeking out food and shelter for itself. However, it soon became clear that this wasn't going to be an easy task, as Mrs. Praphan and her neighbors were now in danger due to its presence. Realizing the severity of the situation, Mrs. Praphan's neighbors quickly called for help from local authorities, who arrived on the scene within minutes. After assessing the situation and considering their options carefully, they decided to approach the snake slowly and attempt to capture it without causing any injury or harm, either to themselves or the snake itself. Fortunately, after some tense moments, the rescue mission was successful, and no one was injured during this incident, including Mrs. Praphan, who was relieved beyond belief when she realized she had escaped unscathed from what could have been a dangerous encounter with this enormous reptile. When Mrs. Praphan Puttawong, a 54-year-old woman living in a small village in Thailand, was suddenly confronted by the 23-foot-long python on the outskirts of her home, local authorities jumped into action. The police and fire brigade were the first to arrive on the scene, closely followed by a team of wildlife experts who were able to assess the situation and guarantee that no harm would be done to either Mrs. Praphan or the snake. The python was carefully removed from its surroundings with extreme caution and placed inside an appropriate container for transportation purposes. On top of this rescue mission, medical personnel were also present at the scene to make sure that Mrs. Praphan had not experienced any severe injuries during her experience with the snake. In addition to these safety measures taken by local authorities, an investigation was launched into how exactly this python had come to be so far away from its usual habitat, swamps and rainforests. It is presumed that someone must have released it into this area, intentionally or unintentionally, for it to have been seen here in such close proximity to a residential area. This incident has sparked debate over wildlife conservation and protection when it comes to wild animals like pythons all over the globe. With more news emerging about similar occurrences throughout different parts of the world, it is becoming increasingly important for people everywhere to educate themselves on these creatures and understand how best they should respond if ever faced with such an encounter in their own backyard. The encounter with the 23-foot-long python had a lasting impact on Mrs. Praphan Puttawong's life. She suffered physical and psychological trauma, but has since become an advocate for wildlife conservation and a symbol of resilience and courage in her local community. The experience left her shaken both physically and mentally, with nightmares concerning snakes plaguing her sleep. Despite this, she was determined to not let the incident define her future, so she set out on a mission to raise awareness of wild animals like pythons and their importance in our ecosystem. Mrs. Puttawong quickly became a symbol of courage in her village as locals began to recognize the bravery she displayed during the incident. She began to speak about her experience on public forums, emphasizing the need for education on wildlife conservation and protection. Her words encouraged others to be more mindful of how they interact with nature, especially when it comes to wild animals like pythons that can be dangerous if not respected properly. Mrs. Puttawong's story soon spread across Thailand and beyond, as news outlets reported on her remarkable story of survival, an incredible feat considering how rare these types of encounters are with such large predators. People from around the world reached out to share their support for Mrs. Puttawong, and expressed their admiration for her bravery in going against all odds without hesitation or fear. Mrs. Prafin is now a passionate advocate for wildlife conservation, using her story as a platform to speak out against animal cruelty and mistreatment, while promoting education about interacting safely with wild animals such as pythons or other potentially dangerous species found in Thailand or elsewhere around the world. Her efforts have been praised by many, and she is truly making a difference in raising awareness about wild animal encounters, something that could very well save lives one day. In recent years, there have been a number of other incidents involving pythons around the world. In Florida, a pet cat was found coiled around by a python in its owner's backyard. In California, a family discovered an 8-foot-long python living in their attic for over 2 months. And in India, authorities had to remove an 11-foot-long python from inside the walls of an apartment building after tenants complained of hearing strange noises coming from within their home. These incidents serve as a reminder that wild snakes can pose a real danger to people and animals alike, and caution must be taken when dealing with them. Pythons are often misunderstood creatures. While they may sometimes be seen as dangerous monsters, it is important to remember that these creatures are part of our planet and have an important role to play in our environment. As such, it is essential that we take steps to protect and conserve them wherever possible. The increasing awareness of these incidents has led to greater public interest in wildlife conservation and protection efforts. Governments around the world are now taking proactive steps towards protecting pythons and other wild animals by implementing laws restricting hunting or poaching and providing resources for research into conservation techniques. It is also important for individuals to educate themselves on interacting safely with wild animals like pythons, should they ever come across one unexpectedly. Knowing how to respond correctly can be essential in preventing injury or harm, both for oneself and for the animal involved, as well as ensuring their safe return back into their natural habitat if necessary.